Visual hallucinations in sight loss, Charles Bonnet Syndrome, presented by Judith Potts of Esme's Umbrella on the 3rd of February 2022. About Live Well. Live Well is a series of events aimed at helping people make the most of life with sight loss. Live Well is a collaborative project between 7 local independent sight societies, which are Sight Advice South Lakes, Cumbria, My Sight's Knots in Nottingham, Sight Airedale in the Airedale area of North and West Yorkshire, Support for Sight in Mid and West Essex, Sight Concern Worcestershire in Worcestershire, Sutton Vision in the London Borough of Sutton, and Outlookers in Huddersfield, West Yorkshire.
This is the Rainbow Group, as people know. We're 7 local, small to medium sight loss charities around the country, and we share our meetings, and we invite who we believe some of the best guests possible in this area. And we'd like to welcome again Judith Potts from Esme's Umbrella, who is without doubt the recognised expert of Charles Bonnet. So off you go, Judith.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And I think your organisation is just wonderful, all 7 of you. That was such a terrific idea. So the first question I always get asked is, why Umbrella and who's Esme? Well, Esme was my mum, and she developed Charles Bonnet Syndrome in her early 90s. Umbrella, because I wanted to shelter everyone who develops the condition. So Esme was a very independent woman, lived on her own, completed successfully and correctly the Telegraph cryptic crossword every day, cooked for herself, generally looked after herself. I knew she had glaucoma, but in those days, I'm afraid I knew very little about sight loss, and certainly not about the various conditions. She was also very, very good at compensating, and she continued her life in a way that was completely remarkable. Until one day I was leaving her flat and she suddenly said, "I do wish these people would get off my sofa." Well, of course, there wasn't anybody sitting on her sofa. And as I took a deep breath, thinking, how do I answer this? She said, "And there's an Edwardian tear-stained street child who follows me everywhere, and a hideous gargoyle-like creature that jumps from table to chair. And sometimes the whole room, or indeed the other day, the garden, morphed into an alien place. It was, in fact, an Edwardian funeral procession." Well, as you can imagine, I had absolutely no idea what could be wrong with her, but there was no doubt that the word dementia was hanging in the air between her and me. At that moment, she wasn't too distressed. She was cross, but she wasn't, on the whole, too angry about it. So I waved goodbye and I went home. And on the way home, I thought, this can't be dementia. She's far too bright and alert. Never mind the cryptic crossword, which I certainly couldn't do. With the most enormous piece of luck, that very day, I read a tiny paragraph buried in the health pages of a newspaper about a condition which developed after sight loss, called Charles Bonnet Syndrome. And I thought, that's exactly what Esme has. So I called her, I said, "Don't worry about it, all will be fine, I'll ring your ophthalmologist." And that is where it all went wrong, because he refused point blank to discuss Charles Bonnet Syndrome with me. He wouldn't tell me why he hadn't warned us that with her diminishing eyesight, this might occur. He just refused to discuss it. Her GP, never heard of it, thought I was being fanciful, said she's obviously got dementia. I said, no, she hasn't, but we didn't get any further than that. And her optometrist had never heard of it either. At that time, I was writing a health column for the Telegraph, and it was mostly about cancer because I'd had a diagnosis and was asked to just sort of raise awareness of breast cancer and its charities and the work. So I thought, I'm going to write about Charles Bonnet syndrome. I need to do some more research. So I went onto the internet, and there I discovered Dr., now Professor Dominic Fitch at King's College London. Dominic is the world authority on Charles Bonnet syndrome. So I called him. I said, I want to write about this. I went to see him. He listened to what I said about Esme and said, yep, that's exactly what she has got. And I said, well, what can I do? And he said, nothing. There's no support. There is medication, but she's in her early 90s. I wouldn't advise it. It's very strong. So I said, okay, fine, I will write something. And I said, now I need you to explain to me about Charles Bonnet syndrome, which he did. And his words are the words that I use to this day. What he said was, when you have full sight, there are messages which run all the time from the retina in the eye to the visual cortex in the brain. The eye acts like a camera and the brain interprets what you're seeing. As sight diminishes from any one of the eye conditions, or from stroke, cancer, accident, diabetes, MS, or something else which damages the optic nerve, as your sight diminishes, those messages slow down or stop entirely. But for some reason that we're still not 100% certain about, the brain doesn't calm down. With nothing to interpret, it fires up and creates its own images. And what you see depends on which part of the brain is firing at that moment. Dominic also stressed to me, and I always stress this, it is not a mental health condition, just caused entirely by sight loss. So I went away, sat at my desk, wrote my first column, and was inundated with emails from people who were asking for more information, just relieved that they hadn't developed a mental health condition, or just wanted to tell me their stories. The years went by. My mum never came to terms with it. It got worse and worse, and she was very distressed and disturbed by it to the end of her life. I continued to write and continued to collect people's stories. And after she died, I received an email from a professor at a university in New York who told me the story of her mother, who had been admitted to a dementia unit because she was hallucinating worms and slugs on her food and in her drink. No one had heard of Charles Bonnet syndrome. The doctor clearly thought the woman was demented, sent her to the unit. No one there had ever heard of it. No one reassured her. She stopped eating and drinking and died. And that was the final straw for me. So in 2015, at the House of Commons, I launched Esme's Umbrella in memory of my mum with 3 aims. The first one, obviously, to raise awareness of this condition, which I know is incredibly common. Dominic thinks probably 1 million people in this country alone. So imagine how many there must be around the world. The awareness raising has gone really quite well, and many more people now discuss Charles Bonnet syndrome. Last year, I worked with the scriptwriters on Coronation Street, and we had a Coronation Street CBS storyline, which was fantastic. And Richard Hawley, the lovely actor who played the character of Johnny Connor, who developed Charles Bonnet syndrome, is actually patron now of Esme's Umbrella. So that has all worked very well. I continue to raise awareness. I still meet doctors who've never heard of it, even ophthalmologists who deny its existence. So it's a bit of an uphill struggle, but we will get there. My second aim was to create support for people who suddenly find that they're living in a world of vivid, silent, visual hallucinations. So I asked local low vision charities like yourselves if they would create Esme Room support groups. And some of them did. And this was all going very well until COVID-19 hit. Then, of course, they all had to close. Within 1 week, it became very obvious that people who live with CBS were having a particularly difficult time. Mike Bailey, who works up in Liverpool at Christopher Grange, had been running a very successful and large Esme Room support group. And he called me and said, we have to do something. I said, yes, we do, but what on earth can we do? And he said, well, I'm going to start a telephone support group, and please may I call it Esme's Friends, which I thought was a brilliant and wonderful idea. My mum would have been absolutely overjoyed. So that is what he did. And now this has spread throughout the country. I think we have 31. The RNIB also run Esme's Friends groups. I think they're about to start their 5th. We know it's very, very helpful to people if they can talk to others with the condition in a safe place and be believed, because it is one of those conditions that it's very hard to describe. The other thing I have on my website are coping strategies, which are all sorts of different ways that might help to switch off the cells that are firing. Also, there is a list of medication which can be tried if the condition is just too bad to bear. This medication has come from Professor Fitch, who is obviously my medical advisor. We also have a list of medication which can make it worse. Now, this is medication taken for other conditions. There's one particular one which is taken for gastric conditions by an awful lot of people, called omeprazole, and its fellow ones with prozole at the end. And we know that makes CBS worse, as does a fever, isolation, stress, and a low sodium count in the blood. That's another one that's come up recently that we know makes it worse. All that information helps to support people, and that is on my website. So Esme's Friends keeps going very well. I'm gathering together a group of counsellors, all of whom are visually impaired and 2 of whom have Charles Bonnet Syndrome, because sometimes people like a one-to-one. The Macular Society do actually Charles Bonnet Syndrome telephone support groups, I think. They're not local ones, they're sort of general ones. And I think they do counselling. I think it's counselling groups actually rather than support, which is great. The more the merrier. So that was the support, and we keep going, and there are all sorts of ideas that I have for the future, particularly now that Esme's Umbrella has received charity status. So I have 3 trustees. I have Professor Dominic Fitch, I have Professor Mariya Moosajee from Moorfields and Great Ormond Street and the Francis Crick, and I have Helen Khan, who is the head of comms at Moorfields Biomedical Research Centre. And apart from that, it's just me, and we're all unpaid. So we hope that we can achieve even more now we're a charity. And then my third aim, of course, was research. Charles Bonnet was a very, very clever man. And in 1760, he documented what was happening to his grandfather, Charles Lulin. Lulin had cataracts, which had been operated on, and I'm sure in a very ham-fisted way in those days. But he was losing his sight. And he talked about the changing tapestries on the walls in the apartment, the carriages running through, the people in their strange outfits. And Bonnet realized that his grandfather was completely sane, so it must be something to do with his sight. So he documented all this, put it to one side. Nobody did anything about it. In the 1930s, a doctor had 4 or 5 patients who talked to him about their hallucinations. So he then called it Charles Bonnet Syndrome, but no research happened. In the 60s, something similar happened. And in the 1990s, Professor Dominic Fitch started his research, which was into visual hallucinations of all types. So at the end of Parkinson's disease, or Lewy body dementia, other dementias, and Charles Bonnet Syndrome. And apart from that, no research had been done. So I was approached by Fight for Sight, which is the big eye research charity. And the chief executive offered me a restricted fund into which any money I collected would go and could only be used for CBS research, which was wonderful. So I went with my begging bowl to several charities, Thomas Pocklington Trust, Blind Veterans, and we put some money into the pot. We then put out a call for a researcher. Now, bear in mind, this was 6 years ago. We got one response. Luckily, Dr. Cat de Silva Morgan at Newcastle University was known to Professor Fitch, so he agreed to oversee her work. And she started the ball rolling. What she did was to look at the brains of people with Charles Bonnet Syndrome after sight loss and compare them to people with sight loss who don't develop it, because there are some. Now, her research will be published this year. It's taken a long time because, and I didn't know this because I don't come from that research part of the health arena, but she has to pay to have her research published. And obviously we didn't have the money to help her at that point. So it's taken some time. There is a difference in the brains, but apparently not what we would expect. So the brains of people with CBS are not hugely more excitable. They are a bit more excitable, obviously, but not hugely. And we will know as soon as she publishes more. So then the years spun on. I managed to work with Professor Andrew Dick at UCL and the Bristol Eye Hospital, very eminent ophthalmologist here, and Dr. August Kohlenbrander, extremely, again, eminent ophthalmologist in America at Smith Kettlewell. And we approached the World Health Organization and we said to them, look, Charles Bonnet Syndrome is a serious condition, incredibly common. You don't have it in your taxonomy of diseases and conditions as anything other than a side effect of sight loss. This is wrong. And we persuaded them. So CBS now has its own code, which is, I always forget it, 9D56. And it is considered and acknowledged as a condition in its own right. So that was very good. Then I managed to gather some more money into my fund, and we put out a call for another researcher, which was 18 months ago. Amid COVID, the whole thing was very difficult, but we had 5 responses, one of which you have heard from Dr. Jasleen Jolly at Oxford. Now, what they are doing at their Nuffield Centre is to take the research in Newcastle a step further with their very sophisticated scanner, and they will look to see what actually is happening in the brain when an hallucination is sparked. So before, during, and after. And Jasleen talked to me about two things, a possible higher pathway than the one I described earlier. Maybe images are held in that pathway. If there is one, we don't know. And also the possibility of a chemical being introduced into the brain before the hallucination happens. A bit like we know there's a chemical introduced into the brain of someone with epilepsy. So just before a seizure, that chemical is released. So we're looking forward to hearing the end of that research. The other person was Dr. Matt Dunn at Cardiff University, and that team is looking at peripheral vision to see if images are held there, if it's more suggestible. Again, we have to wait and see. So my money, along with money from all sorts of other charities, went to those two. But at the same time, I mentioned Professor Mariya Moosajee, who is one of my trustees, who she and I had a long discussion very shortly after the first lockdown, when I said to her, look, I'm really concerned about all these people. And she said, what we need is a proper piece of research, peer-reviewed and published. And she agreed to do it, paid for it actually herself. So she and Dr. Lee Jones did a piece of research to find out from people what was happening and why the hallucinations were so much worse during lockdown. And they have established forever that isolation, stress, and fever make it worse. So that has been peer reviewed and published and is there for future researchers to look at. She then talked to me about children with Charles Bonnet Syndrome, which is something that's been very close to my heart. My background is actually theatre. I was an actress, and I was also a coach for child actors and worked a great deal with them. And I knew that if the images seen were so horrific for adults, what on earth must it be like for children? And when I realized that Mariya worked at Great Ormond Street, I thought, right, this is a good chance. So I talked to her and she said, absolutely, we will do some research. And that is what she and Dr. Lee Jones are doing right now. They have proved prevalence in children. We know that children develop this in the same way as adults do. And she is now taking it to the next stage, which is to talk to the children, find out the impact that it has on not only the child, but the child's family, siblings, friends, whatever. And that will be a really important piece of research. So I'm delighted about that. That's funded by Thomas Pocklington and the Wellcome Trust and all sorts of other charities again. Then I was approached by a PhD researcher at Manchester University who has done a piece of work to prevent people with sight loss, to help prevent people with sight loss from falling over. And she asked if she could carry this on and see what she could find out about how we could help people with CBS from falling over, because this is something which happens all the time. If you are walking even through your own home and suddenly a tiger appears in front of you, you do instinctively try and get out of the way, even if you know full well that this is CBS. So what happens then is you tend to either overbalance and fall over or trip over something that's already there. If that takes you to a hospital or to your own doctor, no matter how much you say, I have got Charles Bonnet Syndrome, they will never have heard of it and will send you down the psych route, which obviously we want to prevent. So I'm delighted that she's doing that piece of research. And the last piece, which is happening at the moment, is probably my favorite. There's a young man called Dr. Amit Patel. Any of you who follow Twitter will know him and his guide dog, Kika. Now, Amit was a trauma doctor at University College Hospital in London until a hemorrhage behind his eyes robbed him of his sight. He has Charles Bonnet Syndrome very badly. His guide dog, Kika, has begun to warn him before the hallucination appears. She puts her head on his lap and she stays there until she knows that it's gone. Well, when I heard this, I was very interested because when I wrote my health column for the Telegraph, I wrote a great deal about the medical detection dogs. You've probably heard about these dogs. They can detect cancer far better than any human test. At the moment, they are sniffing COVID at the ports and airports. They are also alert dogs for conditions like epilepsy, diabetes, chronic pain, Addison's disease, anything where someone will need the intervention of medication to stop a disaster. They know when medication is needed because there is a change in the odor of the owner's skin. So the dog runs off, gets the medication, brings it back, the owner takes it and all is fine. Now, when I heard about Kika, I called Dr. Claire Guest, who leads the charity, and I said, have you ever heard of Charles Bonnet Syndrome? She said, no. So I said, okay. So I explained that to her. And then I told her about Kika. And I said, do you think this is happening? Do you think Kika knows? And she said, oh, yes. She said, I suspect, and it's exactly what they say at Oxford University, that there is a chemical being introduced into the brain. And that is what Kika is detecting. And that is why she knows that when that happens, Amit becomes very upset. He sees the most horrific image. And I thought, right. And before I could say anything, she said, would you like us to do some research to see what we can find out about this? And I said, I would absolutely love you to do it. So that's the last piece of research for the time being. There is a little bit of money left in my pot at Fight for Sight. So we will be putting out a call for another researcher very soon. As I now am a charity, I will be collecting into my own pot. And I'm hoping that I will find some billionaire who wouldn't miss a few 100,000 along the way, because we do need a lot more research. We need prevalence research, and we need obviously medical research, and we need social research. We need to know more about how, because the experience is different for everybody. So we do need to have many more case studies and really take it very seriously, looking at how we can support people. Once the pandemic is over, if it's ever over, I am going to approach the NHS, because now that we have the code in ICD-11, it is the job and duty of the NHS to create a proper pathway for diagnosis, treatment, and support. Because to get diagnosed is quite tricky. Ophthalmologists will do it, psychiatrists will do it, but the ophthalmologists say, oh, it's not my job, it's nothing to do with eyes. It is to do with eyes, but they won't acknowledge that it is. So they shunt you off to a psychiatrist who says, well, it's nothing to do with me because it's not a mental health condition. They will, both of them, actually say, yes, you have CBS, but apart from that, GPs have never heard of it. So I have a campaign running at the moment, which is called #WiseUp2022. And there is a letter on my website, which I would love you all to download and send to your GP or any healthcare professional that you know who has never heard of Charles Bonnet Syndrome. So it does make them wise up, and they might then ask patients before they shoot them off down the mental health pathway. So that is probably it. My mother would be utterly astonished to discover that her name is now synonymous with Charles Bonnet Syndrome and that she is a charity. But without her, we wouldn't be here. So thank you very, very much for listening. Please ask me questions. I'm sure I've left all sorts of things out. I would be delighted to answer.
Right, well, thank you, Judith. This is Tim here again. I'd like to ask the question. You mentioned Dr. Jasleen Jolly and the two routes. Well, if she's doing research, I mean, I have this image that people potentially go to Oxford, but her research means you have to trigger an episode, don't you, to find this chemical? Is that what she's trying to?
Well, no, I mean, there isn't a way of triggering it really, except by being very, very calm. People tell me that when they are totally calm, so for instance, as a passenger in a car, you have no responsibility and you tend to almost drift off. And that's the moment when Charles Bonnet jumps into action. I think that they are just going to look at the brains of people and hope that, sounds awful, doesn't it? But hope that a hallucination appears. It quite often does, because they'll be, I know, using people. I think they could do with more volunteers. So please pass this on to anybody that you know who has the condition. They've got volunteers who are prepared to sit under the scanner for a couple of hours. I think they are paying travel expenses if anybody is interested.
Yeah, and I know one person, for example, who hers is triggered by looking at a TV screen, and what she triggers is flowers around the TV screen, for example. Yeah. There's some people have a very clear trigger, don't they? But some people don't.
Yes, some people do, but I don't think we know enough about it to call it a trigger. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
It could just be that her brain at that moment is doing something. I know that sometimes people, I know somebody who walks past a particular field and sees a medieval army marching through it.
Yeah.
But you see, what we don't know is whether the brain this has happened a couple of times coincidentally, and is the brain then assuming that that's what it's meant to do? Do you see what I mean?
I do, yeah. They have
I mean, it's so complicated, and we have so little research.
Sorry, it's Terry from Sutton Vision. Is it kind of prevalent more in people that are kind of losing their sight, or people that have been born with sight loss? Because if you've been born with it and you're kind of losing your sight slowly,
yeah,
or is it prevalent more with people who kind of lose their sight after birth or something like that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I always get asked the question, do people who are born with no sight have Charles Bonnet syndrome? Probably not, because their brain has not seen anything.
Yeah, I don't mean no sight. I mean born with partly sighted and the sight.
Yes, I know what you mean. I was just sort of going back to a question that somebody else might ask.
Okay.
We will never know, because even if they do see things, they won't be able to describe or tell us what they are, because they have never they haven't the words, if you see what I mean. Yeah. So children, if you've had sight for even six months, you probably can have Charles Bonnet syndrome, but again, you will have lost your sight before you have the words to describe the images. So it's very hard. Children, we don't really know how many children have Charles Bonnet syndrome. It's, I suspect, more prevalent in the older generation because there are more people who lose their sight from something like macula.
Yeah.
So I think the biggest tranche of the figure of 1 million comes from people with macular disease of one kind or another. But yes, I mean, it is a really interesting thing. And with children, it's hard because, as you know, children have imaginary friends.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do you know that the little girl sitting on the floor in the pretty Edwardian type dress described by a girl or a boy is an imaginary friend or is an hallucination? It tends to be from about the age of 8 that it becomes obvious that they are hallucinations.
Oh, okay.
Does that help? Did that?
Yes. I was just interested. That's what just why. Yeah. Because to me, it must be really difficult to diagnose it if someone's got dementia and got macula, and how do they? It must be really hard to kind of diagnose someone with Charles Bonnet.
It is, and you're quite right. They can have both, and that makes it very difficult. Yeah. Sometimes people will email me about a relative, and they will say the person is shouting at the hallucinations, or saying the hallucination is going to attack, or that the hallucination is shouting back, and then of course it's not Charles Bonnet syndrome. However, it might be Charles Bonnet syndrome as well, so it's very difficult.
Yeah.
Can I have an input, please? Sorry.
Yeah.
My name is Mrs. Ebanks. I've had Charles Bonnet now for quite some time. Mm-hmm. But what I find most irritating with my one is that they touch me. They touch me when I'm sleeping. I feel like somebody touched me on my feet and it wakes me out of my sleep. And that is very annoying. And
yes,
I get to the stage that I'm slinging things at them and tell them to get out and, going crazy.
We don't usually associate Charles Bonnet syndrome with any other sense. So that's very interesting that you, Professor Fitch would say that it is only visual. So I'm wondering if there's something else happening. If you're feeling, what is it that you feel touch you?
Like, when somebody would want to wake you up and they would say, wake up. They don't talk to me or anything like that. It's just, I feel somebody touching me, like they're touching me to wake up, because it always seems to be when I am sleeping and it touched me and I wake up, and sometimes I see figures and people and images and things, and I'm chucking things at them.
I wonder again if it's your brain as you open your eyes and wake up and you see the image standing there. I wonder if it's kind of in reverse. You think they've woken you, because what you're describing is, the images are what I hear all the time about people waking up and finding someone standing in there. I just wonder, because he would definitely say that it's only visual. So it could very well be that you quite rationally think that the person standing there has woken you.
But I do feel like somebody's touching me. Otherwise I wouldn't wake up.
Okay.
I mean, definitely. And that is so scary. And well, I mean, it was scary before I found out that I had Charles Bonnet Syndrome. But now that I'm coping with it as much as I can, but it's the touching.
The touching. Okay.
That freaks me out, because I can't sleep properly. It makes me lose my sleep.
I'm going to ask Dominic, could you have someone email me? You can do it via the website if it's easier. Do you have an email address?
Yeah, but I have to have somebody to help me, because I as I said, I
can't
do it. I think that one of the
I can do that for you, Vanessa. It's Terry.
Oh, thank you.
That would, if you let me have her name and email address and everything, and I'll ask Dominic what he thinks about this. Okay?
Yes. I really appreciate it, because it's very, very interesting to know.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll do that for you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
I have a question, if that's okay. Is there further information about how Charles Bonnet Syndrome affects people who also are impacted by deafness as well as sight loss, as well as Charles Bonnet Syndrome?
Not really. There is an auditory version, just to make life more complicated, of Charles Bonnet Syndrome, but you only hear choral music. So you hear choirs singing. What you hear doesn't match the image that you're seeing.
Okay.
But otherwise, I don't know of any. I do know of people who have Charles Bonnet Syndrome and who are deaf. Yes, but I'm not sure it impacts any worse, if you see what I mean. Do you have an example that you were thinking about?
Yeah, no, I have recently started working with the Macular Society, and a lady had got in contact the other day about her mother, who has got Charles Bonnet Syndrome, but is also deaf as well, and she's trying to seek out some support for her, because I think her mum is finding it very difficult. And yeah, so I don't even know if there are resources that you might be able to point us out of as well.
Gosh, do you know, I don't. She would need a one-to-one support, wouldn't she?
Absolutely, yeah.
She'd need someone to go into her home, I would have thought. And unless her local social services has a sensory, there are sensory somethings who work for social services. That might be the answer, providing they know what Charles Bonnet Syndrome is.
Yes, no, absolutely. No, and at least that, coming here today, I can give them a little bit more information about that as well. So, okay, thank you very much.
I'll just mention, I mean, I lost my sight 4 years ago, and I, touch wood, I haven't had any Charles Bonnet, but the only time I sort of have ever seen anything in the void is like you said, middle of the night, just very kind of relaxed. I was just up doing some music and doing not much, alone. And at that point it was only like one night, I think, I could see what I would describe as sort of nice, colourful engineering schematics. Very, very like a user interface almost on a computer, or things like that. And I you know, to be honest, like it wasn't. I could pretty much switch it off just by not looking at it. It would kind of go away. But they were kind of. I was kind of intrigued. I was like, I wish I could have videoed it, because you could probably sell some of these really nice colour schemes and things to a company. I was really quite impressed with what was coming out. I was like, wow, that's good stuff. But it was just like, kind of like you said, it was at a time where my brain was pretty tired, you know, and I was kind of interested in Charles Bonnet, so I was trying to make it happen. I was like, I wonder if I stare into this space long enough, I'll see something. And I did, you know, but that's... And
you did, yeah. Well, of course, we don't know whether anyone could control it.
Right.
But certainly the colours are incredibly vivid. I spoke to a woman not so long ago who said it's like watching a gardening documentary. It's so vivid and clear. I can see a drop of rain on a leaf. Absolutely amazing. But for her, the problem was that it happened at all the most inconvenient moments.
Okay.
So she, you know, I don't know if in future somebody might be able to control when they see these things or not. I don't know. But for her, she had lost her sight 6 years before, and she'd seen no colour since. And then suddenly, the world was full of colour. So
yes, that was the other thing that I enjoyed about that experience. I don't know if I had anything to do with Charles Bonnet, but when I was looking at those pictures and nice diagrams and things, I was really like, wow, blue again, and, you know, things again. But I had to sort of make myself focus to see that. But I enjoyed it for, you know, half an hour or something.
It sounds as though it could have been. I mean, you know, patterns, grids, and people see absolutely anything. When I first started, I began a list of what people saw, and I gave up very quickly after about 6 weeks, because it was just anything and everything. So that sounds to me as though it could have been. I'm not a doctor, so I can't say definitely, but it does sound the sort of thing that people see. They see musical notes or maps or words or numbers. That's another thing, which kind of cover everywhere. So you can be very disoriented from it. It's not necessarily frightening to some people what they see, but they can, if it's like, you know, a huge sort of spray paint of something, it can be very disorienting.
I mean, that's one thing. What I saw was, in that experience, was all two-dimensional. So it was all like maps and charts and that kind of stuff. It wasn't like anything 3D.
No.
So,
fascinating.
Anyway,
Thank you.
Could I just ask Judith, you mentioned some of the contributing factors as stress, isolation. Could I ask, with the pandemic and everything that's brought for many people, do you have any indication of CBS increasing in terms of frequency or the imagery of people who might have had it and it's more intense because of the isolation and the stress that might be caused through this period?
There has been no research on that, but I do know that people who spoke to Professor Moosajee said that they had never had it before. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it was the pandemic. I can't say that for sure, but I do think that, first of all, you know, if you are very stressed, it does make it much, much worse. So possibly it would bring it on. I don't know, but that is a possibility, yes. And I think also the fact that during the pandemic, people missed their eye appointments for one reason or another. Their eyesight will have deteriorated quicker and they will have reached that 60% loss quicker. So, you know, it could have caused a problem for a lot of people.
Yes, thank you.
Sorry, it's Terry again. Do you think it's a way of the brain kind of looking for stimulation itself? in a way.
Well, I think the problem is when those messages stop, the brain has nothing to interpret.
Yeah.
And it's used to the constantly interpreting what you see.
Yeah, so it's looking for something to
so it says, well, you know, hang on, there's something wrong here. Let's just flick something up.
Yeah.
But why each person's brain decides to show a dog running across the floor, a cockroach, a pattern, we don't know why the brain chooses what it chooses. But interestingly enough, I said to Dominic a while ago, because people describe, if they see humans, images of humans, they tend to be in costume of some kind. Military, very common, all types. I know someone who sees a First World War pilot standing in the corner of the room all the time, virtually. So military, medieval is another one, or Middle Eastern, the long words. It tends to be long, and it tends to be always a headdress of some kind.
Oh, right.
So someone had just described to me, they saw, they found themselves in the middle of a party, which was very much Edwardian, so very much Oscar Wilde, with the women with the big hats and the lace up to the neck. And I said to Dominic, what if you talk to someone who doesn't know our culture at all, and they had Charles Bonnet syndrome, what would they see? Would they see something different? And he said, no, they would see the same. Obviously, they wouldn't describe it as Oscar Wilde. They would describe it as something else. But it is the same picture, the same image, which is absolutely riveting, I think.
It is. It's really interesting.
It is a weirdly fascinating condition, not for people who live with it, but for the researchers. I think they've suddenly stumbled on something which they really want to give their time to.
Judith, Carl Harrison here again from the Macular Society.
Hello.
I've had it said to me many times that, you know, the images that people see, if it's of a person, it isn't somebody they recognize. I've only ever heard it once where somebody said to me, it's a loved member of the family that's passed away. But somebody had mentioned to me that they don't see images of people that they do recognize, and therefore that might suggest it's not a memory prompted situation.
Right.
Is that consistent with your
right? No, that's exactly right. People say to me, I woke up and my sister was sitting on the bed. I think that's because that's what the person would like. But Dominic will tell you that it's not memory. You don't see dead relatives, no, or friends. But I think, and I mean, I'm such an amateur in this, but I wonder why people say that to me. And I think it must be because they hope it is that person.
Yes.
That makes sense.
I think that just gives them comfort, doesn't it, in a way?
Yeah. I mean, when we did the script for Coronation Street, the writers very much wanted the character to see his dead son, and I said, no, you can't do that, because they were going to. I think I actually did the actor out of a couple of days filming, which I felt very bad. But anyway, I said, no, you can't do that. So in the end, they decided not to have any image there at all, and also to describe it as being just the back of somebody.
Yeah.
Because I didn't want any question about, was it the dead son? Because that's not what you see. I just think it's that when people say they have, it's that's what they wanted more than anything else.
Yeah.
Just that chance to see that person again. Sometimes they are without faces. My mother saw faceless people sitting on her sofa, which was really rather horrible.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But other times, I think the pilot that I was mentioning, you could actually see the obviously just come off mission, so you could see the dirt and the tiredness and you see such detail It's quite extraordinary. Probably more detail than a sighted person would notice if they saw the same image.
Could I come in there?
Yeah.
A friend of mine had been ill, and when she was recovering enough to go out for a meal, we had a meal out, and she said, "Oh, it's most unpleasant. I can see a huge eye on your forehead." And it was clearly upsetting her quite a lot. She knew about Charles Bonnet, so I think she thought it was that.
Yes, and I think she was probably absolutely right, but it's very distressing.
Yes.
And I think particularly when people see, like the lady in America, the worms and slugs on their food and in their drink, it's very, very hard to get over that. Unless you have someone with you who says, no, look, it's absolutely fine. I'm going to have a taste. Now you'll be fine. Or even try some of the coping strategies to sort of shunt your brain into another gear and keep the brain occupied. We know that once you are in that sort of half wake, half sleep state, that's when Charles Bonnet leaps into action. If you can keep your brain occupied. So when the hallucination happens, we talk about reaching out towards it, standing up if you're sitting down if you're standing up, walking up and down, whistling, singing, clapping your hands, clicking your fingers, anything that you can try. Everybody's different. These are just some strategies I've collected from people with the condition who find they're fairly helpful. Other people find eating ginger, real ginger, helps. But if you're taking any other medication, I think you need to check with your GP before you eat ginger. CBD oil, again, people swear by CBD oil, which seems to be the cure-all at the moment. Omega-3 oil. I know there is a couple of groups who are trying mindfulness meditation and aromatherapy massage, because that keeps the brain active. Because with the massage, you're feeling it, so your brain is working on that. With the mindfulness, it's not like trying to meditate by staring into space. Mindfulness, you have to be aware of where you are and bringing yourself back into the present all the time. And I think they might be of help. I mean, nothing works for everybody. No medication works for everybody. It's trial and error, I'm afraid.
Can I just ask a question, Judith? It's Jo Reader from the Macular Society. Hi. We're talking about the images that people see during awake, while the person's awake. Is there any indication that people have these images during dreaming state? Is there anything?
A couple of people have said to me they seem to continue all night, but I don't know if that's because they open their eyes in the night and see. Or you don't actually have to open your eyes. You can see the images with your eyes shut. But what I mean is they wake up. That was a bad phrase of mine. They wake up and see them. So they say they've been with them all night. I don't think so, no. I think Professor Fitch, is very adamant that dreams are completely different.
Yeah. Okay.
But as I say, we just don't know. I mean, in 10 years' time, we might have discovered all sorts of other things. And then we can say everything I'm saying today is completely wrong. But as far as we know at this moment is all I can say.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, people, we're at 11 o'clock. We've gone 11 o'clock. Yes, that's Judith. Unless there's anything really urgent, I'm going to call an end to the meeting. Is there anything really, really urgent that people want? Because while we've got Judith here, okay, we will bring her back, of course, if she wants to come again.
I would love to. Anytime.
It's been absolutely excellent.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very good. Thank you.
It's very good. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Judith. That's a good round of applause.
Thank you.
Live well and future vision. We hope you enjoyed this presentation. The Live Well events take place on the second Thursday of each month at 10 a.m. Future Vision sessions take place on the fourth Thursday of each month at 10 a.m. and are technology events aimed at people living with sight loss. To attend the next session or to suggest future topics, please contact your local Sight Society, who will be able to provide you with the Zoom link.